All right, and we are live, evidently. Am I audible? Hope I'm audible. Gonna just chill for a bit while people hopefully stroll on in here. I did get some questions on the announcement post, so I'll be getting to those here in a minute. Join the live stream, losers. Sunglasses emoji. There we go. Because that's how I interact with my Discord server. Pink lemons. My mom is a cranberry. Now, it'd be really cool if you were talking about the band, the Cranberries, but I imagine you're just saying stupid stuff, so probably not. Watch the vid about how science became unscientific. Brilliant, thanks. Oh, you're real late to that party. That's an old video. In fact, the last time I did a live stream, I was talking about how I really want to kind of redo that one and go even harder on that topic. But I've got some other things on my plate at the moment, so maybe I'll get around to that sooner or later. So, new subscriber here. Well, that's great. You're gonna now see the very intense, acute contrast between my video essay persona and how I am when I am just speaking off the cuff about stuff. And yeah, we'll see how you like that, I suppose. Let me go ahead and address some of these questions that I got from you guys, and I'll do that while we're still building some momentum viewership wise. And then we'll start to really get into the topics at hand, because there's a few things I want to talk about, actually. Do I share Steiner's concept of the eighth sphere and his whole thing about devolved, disembodied entities trying to drag us humans into it? Blah, blah, blah. Well, like to me, it's not terribly clear exactly what Steiner means by the eighth sphere, frankly. There are times where it seems like he's talking about this kind of oblivion, where things that are not able to get with the program of achieving the eschaton, future Vulcan, are just kind of obliterated. And other times he talks about it as though it's like it's almost like a stage of solar system evolution or Earth evolution. And yeah, I'm not so sure about that, but I mean, when he talks about the mechanization of the world and the way that this mechanical labyrinth thing is very much oriented towards dehumanizing human beings, essentially stripping us of the ego, capital E, stripping us of our ensoulment, really. I think he's absolutely correct that uh, those forces in our world, the greatest possible threat to them is the human individuality, human agency, human freedom. And so we're seeing this in a lot of ways right now. One example of this, I think, is probably going to be the use of psychedelics within the psychotherapeutic and pharmacological industry, because psychedelics have a lot of potential for making the human mind very, very plastic, kind of de-rigidifying it. And this is why, for example, psilocybin is so effective for treating things like alcoholism and nicotine, because it can loosen things up in such a way that the human mind and our behavioral patterns and whatnot can be kind of re-territorialized. And this is also why within tribal societies or gangs, for that matter, you have this orientation towards these kind of liminal sort of initiation rituals, hazing rituals, that kind of thing, where you want to create this kind of extreme state, because in extreme situations, extreme trauma, think of like oh, I forgot the name of the tribe, but the Amazonian tribes, they take the like bullet ants and put it as a glove around the person. It's supposed to create this just absolutely unbearable pain. That's one way you can go about it. Uh, Entheogenic drugs are another way you can go about it. You're forcing the human mind into a kind of liminal state. Where the sense of selfhood can be kind of broken down and then reconstituted. That's really what the human ego is. The self, the soul. It's all the same thing. The You have the I, the self identification, right, and then you have this kind of membrane which extends out from that. And it encompasses the body, and it can encompass other people, family members, loved ones, etc. It's very semi-permeable. It's very malleable, or at least it can be very malleable. And the point of these liminal states is to make it more malleable. And so within a tribe or a gang or something like that, the point is to make it more malleable so that when the self is reconstituted, it's more grafted onto the tribe, as it were. And so anyway, the danger here then is that now that those powers are being recognized by the machine, the pharmaceutical industry, the kind of corporate psychotherapy complex, you've got this idea of human mental and physical health, human health in general, really, which is about being a functioning cog within the machine. And a really great way to make someone into a functioning cog within the machine is to make them into zombies, essentially, break down their sense of individuality, make it so that they're in this disassociated state where they're perfectly happy to sit in the pods and eat the bugs. You know what I mean? And McMindfulness is also a part of this, of course. The bastardization of various forms of Eastern philosophy and mysticism by the West is also feeding into this war on the human ego, the human soul, really. The word ego oftentimes has a kind of bad reputation within spiritualistic circles, and I'm doing my damnedest to counteract that The ego is not a problem to be solved. The human ego is the tip of the spear. It is the embodied mirror image of the soul, really. And the human ego is also the best defense mechanism that we currently have against all of the forces within our society, corporate or Ahrimanic or what have you, which very much want to vampirize us in whatever ways they can get away with. Ahriman's earthly incarnation cannot be averted. I'm not sure what you mean by that. What am I drinking? Some kind of like latte thing. Anyway, what was the question I was answering? Steiner's concept of the eighth sphere. Yeah. So I mean, and the thing is that I think that this is going to result in some form of divergence, frankly, where a lot of people are going to become eyeless, as Steiner would say, egoless. Their sense of individuality and identity of personhood itself, really humanness itself, really, those are going to be stripped away from a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to they're going to be okay with that because they're going to feel like they have achieved some sort of enlightenment, where they're just passively, sedated and kind of chill with whatever, it's not hard to take these mystical spiritualist philosophies and twist it into something like that. And this is exactly what you're seeing. So, yeah, I think that the mechanization of the human world, the ultimate logical consequence of that process of mechanization is the dehumanizing of the human. And that specifically means destroying the human I, capital I, if you guys aren't familiar with Steiner's terminology. And so is that the eighth sphere? I think so. I think that's what he's talking about. So excited for the talk, and perhaps this would be best for a different discussion, but on one of your recent videos, I was struck by your claim that extraterrestrials could not exist based on the logic of evolutionary spirituality. Yeah, I firmly 100% believe that there are no like technologically advanced alien species beyond our solar system. There are no biological beings with the eye, that self-reflective loop of subjectivity per se. Okay, and if you're not familiar with my lingo here, subjectivity is not consciousness in general. Yeah, in fact, the way you can think of it is like you've got consciousness, capital C, which is just everything. And then you've got awareness and subjectivity. So awareness is emptiness. It's like the sunyata, it's the empty sky. It is the receptivity to relationality, which is the receptivity to experience. It is experientiality as such. Being and awareness are essentially identical. And then subjectivity is the loop. That's the I. That's what we're talking about in the Ever-Present Origin series. Nope, no Galactic Federation. Sorry. There are other intelligences beyond our solar system, but we already know about those. Those are called the stars. They are alive. And really, the way that you can think of it is that our solar system is like an embryonic star. It's not done yet. The other stars that we're seeing up there, those are finished because we are the tip of the spear. We like all of cosmic evolution has culminated in the realization of the human ego, capital E ego, right? The human subjectivity as such. That is the point of all this. Because that self-reflectivity, that self-conceptual apprehension, that is the loop which really generates reality from pure being. So, with that said, then I think that it may be that there are biological organisms outside of our solar system. So there might be things like plant life or even some form of animal life, microbial life in other solar systems. And the reason why I think that is likely is because there has to be this kind of accumulation that happens, right? Where a lot of work had to be done in advance before the story of our solar system could begin. And I think a lot of that work probably did involve kind of creating the basic blueprints, the basic archetypal structures, which would be drawn upon in the evolution of biological life on our planet. So, for example, it may be that there are stars out there where the entire life cycle was really about just microbial life, single-celled organisms, or about plant life, right? And then once that was achieved and fleshed out, that was the end of that life cycle. The star swallows up its planets, and then the memory of that work that was done is then incorporated into the morphic space, the pleroma, cosmic memory, the akasha, whatever you want to call it. And then that can be drawn upon later on. And so there was this accumulative process, as it were, where many generations of stars preceded our own, but we are the first because it has to be singular. That's the thing, in order for it to really be what it needs to be. Like the story of the evolution of our solar system is like a cosmic bottleneck, right? Because you've got this giant fractal, right? If you've seen the EPO series, you're familiar with the way I'm using that tree of life toroidal type diagram, and the perspectival structure of consciousness represents such a bottleneck, a birth canal, right? Where everything has to be narrowed down. And so we see this in the evolution of human consciousness, right? With this hyper individualization and so hyper alienation of the human subjectivity. And anyway, so that same pattern is happening at larger scales, such that our solar system is kind of the bottleneck of this larger kind of cosmic evolutionary process which is occurring. And so yeah, I imagine if there's anybody new to my channel stepping in here and hearing me say this, they're going to be like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Because I'm kind of presuming that you've seen at least some of the EPO series, because if you have not, then you are not going to understand a word that I just said. Exactly my reaction. I just joined. Yeah, sorry. That's like like what I was just talking about is like major inside baseball. So let's try to get to some non-inside baseball. I want to address some of these questions, and then I want to talk about some more topical stuff. Would you still love me if I was a crystal serpent? Absolutely, babe. Neptune moved into Aries. That I'm going to hold off on, because that's kind of the next thing I want to address regarding current events. Do you think humans have actual independent souls slash experiencing organs, or do you think human consciousness is just a portion of the big God consciousness separated only by the ego? Um, if the latter one's true, how does an individualistic Steinerian reincarnation work if the ego dies along with the body? Well, it just doesn't. The thing is that it's not just that consciousness in this broader cosmic sense carries on after we die. Like, this is the way that like someone like Bernardo Kastrup would put it, right? Like, that the sense of individual consciousness is really a kind of dissociation from what he calls mind at large, right? So the big consciousness. And then when you die, it's just like a reassociation into the cosmic consciousness, right? And he draws upon uh, the research, neurological and psychological research into people who have dissociative identity disorder, MPD, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I mean, he's onto something. He's totally onto something. This idea of dissociation as a way that consciousness can kind of individuate into separate identities. Yes, I completely agree with that. But it doesn't just dissolve when the biological body dies. Not for human beings, because again, the subjectivity, that loop of self-referential conceptual self-apprehension, okay, that is crucial here, because that's really the core of what human identity actually is. We're not just our bodies. When we say I, we are referring to that loop itself. All right. So the way that Gottlob Fichte talks about this, he says that the I is nothing other than its own self-positing. So that's a pretty far out, German phenomenology way of putting it. But essentially, that little loop of subjectivity is in itself formless. It doesn't really have any contents beyond the concept of unity itself. And that's crucial here. That's the way Fichte was able to derive all this from Immanuel Kant, because of Kant's idea of the unity of apprehension, or the unity of, what does he call it? Unity of apperception, the synthetic unity of apperception. So basically, Kant realizes that there is this necessary concept or formative principle, let's say, of unity within phenomenology in general, within experience itself. And so this, from there, that concept of unity is then kind of the basis from which Kant is then going to develop this notion of the synthetic a priori, where he's like, okay, in order for there to be this unity in human experience, then there are certain prerequisites for that. And then Fichte then builds upon that, and he says, okay, well, from there, we can actually derive that the noumenal reality of human subjectivity is that self-reflectivity of the concept of unity, which is a giant mouthful, but basically that's the spark, right? All right, that's what Giordano Bruno is going to call these sparks of divinity, right? And of course, for Bruno, those are the building blocks of reality, and he's right. And what's significant about the human being is that this loop is able to happen within an individual biological body, because we have the nervous systems that are actually needed for that to actually happen imminently, for that to actually be enacted by a biological body. And so when we do that, that I is then creating this kind of membrane, like I kind of alluded to earlier. When you say I, you're not just pointing to yourself as this kind of empty identity, right? Your I includes your body and your memories and to some extent even your loved ones and your pets and your belongings that you have a sense of attachment to. Like there's this semi-permeable and very elastic membrane of selfhood which extends out from that spark, as it were. And because of that, then you have the capacity for the soul really to individuate into separate little souls, as opposed to everything just being part of one gigantic oversoul, which is the state that plants and animals and frogs and termites, everything else is within that. That's what Jean Gebser would call the archaic structure of consciousness. It's basically everything before us, before our fall from Eden, as it were, is encompassed within that archaic structure, within which there's not yet a sense of I as something that is really distinct from an external world. Now, you do have distinction, right? Like an animal, for example, there is this kind of embodied sense of like where the organism ends and the world begins, right? And you see this even implicitly in like immune systems, for example. An organism's immune system has to be able to delineate very carefully between what belongs inside and that which belongs outside. And that's necessary in order to keep the organism alive. And so there is a sense of self-identity there. But then what we're talking about with the human being is like the next order of that. We're like moving a step higher, where it's not just self-identity, it is a conceptual self-apprehension, where the self is the form of self-unity. So anyway, to come back to this reincarnation thing. So what happens here is this. You have this kind of splitting apart, as it were, of the soul of the world into individual souls, and that's the fall from Eden, right? That's the capacity to apprehend the distinction between good and evil, right? Like formlessness, celestial and terrestrial, ideal versus real, where the ideal here is that unity concept, right? And then as that I is embodied, it forms these attachments to its own history, its own body, its memories, all this stuff. And then as the organism dies, as the biological body dies, that I and the constellation extending out from it, which individuates it as something specific and discrete, that is maintained within the pleroma, within morphogenetic space, morphic space, right? That it is still there as this kind of living memory. And yes, it's able to reinstantiate itself. And ultimately, there's a teleology to that reinstantiation as well, because what that soul is trying to do, it's trying to essentially resolve the tension, the friction, the agony, as it were, of self-world division, right? There's this very acute alienation from the world that comes about because of that sense of internal interiority. And so it wants to fix that. It wants to solve that problem somehow. And ultimately, the way that problem is solved is a long story, but basically it's fully realizing itself and its potential. And so this is why it goes through these stages of the different structures of consciousness. Each structure is like further realizing the soul as the ego, as it were. And the end goal of that then is this reassociation within which that discrete individual identity is maintained, but there's this becoming enclosed, becoming encompassed and sublimated into this unity that is more than the sum of its parts. Crispy's drawings are cool. So, moving right along. Did I miss one? I don't think so. I think we're good. All right, cool. So the next thing to talk about here, next order of business, is going to be that today, Neptune ingressed into Aries from Pisces. And the last time this happened was 1861. And for those of you who understand your, oh yeah, it is scary. For those of you who know your history, that's alarming. Because it's not just Neptune moving into Pisces, or excuse me, into Aries from Pisces. It's also, we've got Pluto in Aquarius, and we've got Uranus in Gemini. And so it's just civil war. I don't know. It's going to be something. It's going to be something absolutely horrifying. Yeah, I'm like a little worried, frankly. Did you guys see, actually right before I got on here, I was watching this Tim Dillon clip where he was talking about this like ball thing that they were having at Mar-a-Lago, and you've got all these like wealthy weirdos there, and they're all wearing like dog masks and these 18th century like ball gowns, and they're like dancing to this like jazz music, and it's the most eyes wide shut shit I have ever seen. And I'm just like, this is it. This is our Nero fiddling while Rome burns, man. Like, that is so weird. And for that to be happening while you've got these, you know, the things with ice and the people getting shot and all that, which is just whole other thing. But in any case, this is here latte has gone directly through my system, and so I need to use the restroom real quick. So I'm going to be right back, guys. And I imagine that several people have probably tried to ask me questions, and that's all just flown by me. So maybe I'll get back to that. All right. One moment, guys. Okie doke. Anyway, so I was watching a video earlier today when I was at work by what's his name, Professor Zhang, whatever his name is, the what's it called, predictive history guy. I like him, by the way. His explanations of like consciousness and Platonism are a little rough around the edges, but he's pretty good. I've got specs on my glasses and they're annoying the hell out of me, so technical difficulties. Anyway, and he's discussing, you know, the current geopolitical situation as he does, and he was talking about the way that the United States is pivoting from the kind of soft power that it exerted since the end of the Cold War where, it's basically using economic dependency and things like that in order to be the global hegemon. And now it's pivoting more towards maintaining that hegemony through naval power, through actually like they're talking about blockading Cuba and things like that. I believe wasn't there a Russian oil tanker that was seized by the United States? And so the United States is looking to use its naval supremacy as the most important kingpin that it's got on board. And that's really interesting here, because if you guys recall my rant about this from last time, you've got the United States and you've got really two different culture forms that work in the United States, right? You have the geographic, latent, boots on the soil form language, which is really inherited from pre-colonial times. That's where you've got the primordial symbol at the heart of that form language is the Thunderbird, right? And so we see this in the Wright brothers, the space shuttle, the 9/11, all kinds of things like this kind of duality of the Faustian Spire. Okay, those of you who are familiar with Oswald Spengler know about that, this idea of Faustian civilization. I forget exactly what Spengler says the Ur symbol of Faustian civilization is. But whatever, it doesn't matter because I know what it is. It's the spire, right? And so we see this spire motif evolving throughout history. You've got the Doric column, which then becomes the medieval Gothic cathedral spire, which then becomes Big Ben and the Eiffel Tower, which then becomes the skyscrapers in New York, which eventually becomes the Saturn V rockets. And now the space phalluses of people like Musk and Bezos and so forth. So, two separate form languages that have been in very intense tension with one another throughout the entire history of the United States. There's always been this tension between the sense of American culture as the people, right? The ordinary, proletariat, as it were, and then this other thing, right? Think of what was that guy with a big red beard? Oh, what was the name of that song? He got on Joe Rogan. It was really popular like a year or two ago. What was that guy's name? Anyway, whatever. Richmond, north of Richmond. There you go. So that right there is a great example. People think of that as like a conservative anthem. And yeah, I mean, the conservatives love it, but that's not really what's going on there in that song. That song, what it's really illustrating is that sense of alienation of American culture as such from this pseudo Faustian civilization, which is really just kind of an offshoot of the British Empire, which is now the American Empire. Oliver Anthony. Yeah, that was his name. Don't take this as me necessarily endorsing him or whatever the hell his political shtick is. I don't know anything about him, but seems like a cool guy, I guess. But I say that about most people. So anyway, so you've got this tension, right? Now, before I already talked about how you see this duality embodied in the space shuttle. And again, let's talk about the how that duality is encoded within our birth chart, right? Within Uranus and Gemini, right? The channel Symbolic Studies has a really good video. You guys should totally look this up and watch this video because it's not very long, but it's absolutely fascinating. Symbolic Studies, they did a video on all of the Gemini symbolism that surrounded the the whole George Floyd thing, right? And that in itself is like it's all gesturing towards the same kind of semiotic landscape, as it were, which is the evolving soul of the United States. So, anyway, space shuttle, right? You have the bird, the Thunderbird, that's the shuttle, and then you have the Spire, the rocket, the booster rockets, right? And so the Thunderbird is not fully developed yet. It has these little nubby wings. It can't fly on its own, and so it has to be bootstrapped into the air by the Faustian, right? So, right now, what's about to happen is we're going to see this duality play out in a different way with the aircraft carriers, because in the aircraft carrier you have something very similar there. The British Empire was a naval empire. Naval power was extremely important throughout the really the entire modern age, right? And the British Navy was always the crown jewel, as it were, of British hegemony. And then there's also the connection to Pisces, right? Pisces as the oceanic, right? And so the American aircraft carrier then embodies this duality in yet another way. American aerospace power is something that really began to develop during the 20th century, but there's always been this kind of balancing between naval power and aerospace power. And what we're seeing here, what we will be seeing here over the next 10 years, 20 years is going to be, I think, the last hurrah of Faustian civilization. And that's going to get ugly, right? This turning towards naval power is indicative of that. Yeah, the air dominance of the United States, that is a manifestation of this Thunderbird motif, as I've said. It's a completely different form language than the British Faustian form language that is really embodied within the American empire itself. They're not the same thing. It's the bureaucracy, the deep state, or the higher echelons are really a completely different culture than the boots on the ground, ordinary mom and pop Americana American culture. And the aerospace power is actually really drawing from that ground level form language. And so this is ultimately going to be, I think, a positive thing in the long run, because the breakdown of Faustian civilization is going to allow for the native American form language, and I say that in the sense of like not in like an ethnic or racial way, but in the sense that the Thunderbird is the form language which is actually native to the geography of the United States. That is going to be able to really bloom and realize itself in a way that was not possible previously because of that pseudomorphic dominance of Faustian civilization. Pseudomorphosis, that's Spengler's term for this. When you have one alien imperial form language that is kind of plastered on top of a certain geography such that the native form language can't really get up through the cracks yet. It's like cement over the landscape. And that's the situation that the United States has been in for its entire history. And so this breakdown is going to allow for an authentically American culture to begin to realize itself. And I think that something very similar is going to happen with Russia. because we see the exact same thing with Russia. If you look at Russian history, this story is very blatant. It starts with the Mongols. But then afterwards, you look at these figures like Catherine the Great, Peter the Great. They were either German or they were obsessed with Germany, obsessed with Britain. They were trying to mimic Faustian civilization. So Peter the Great, for example, well, Catherine the Great was German. Peter the Great, he changed the uniforms of the Russian army to a Prussian blue because he was so obsessed with Germany. He wanted a navy like Britain. That's why St. Petersburg came into existence at all. And then with the Soviet era, the intelligentsia of Russia, they always kind of disavowed the native Russian culture form. They were always looking to the West and trying to kind of imitate that. They really wanted to kind of disidentify themselves with Russia. And you certainly see that in the Marxists, the Soviets, but it goes back even before that. If you look at Dostoevsky and Tolstoy as well, in both of those guys, you see this exact same narrative playing out. Dostoevsky, you see it in The Underground Man, right? You see it in Raskolnikov, and the way that his kind of intellectualism kind of disassociated him from the world around him in such a way that he was able to murder the pawnbroker because of his kind of intoxication by these rationalistic ideas of morality. Tolstoy, in his biography, talks about this, the way that he kind of became intoxicated by this Western atheistic form of philosophical rationalism, empiricism, in such a way that he completely disavowed Russian culture and Orthodox Christianity and whatnot. And then eventually later on, he kind of came back to it. But this is the pattern over and over again with Russian history. And even now with Putin, and that kind of thing. The oligarchs of Russia are still doing the exact same thing they've always done. They're still in a completely different universe than that actual organic Russian form language, which has never been able to fully realize itself because of that pseudomorphic overlay of Faustian civilization. And so I imagine what's about to happen, if things really go to shit in the way that it looks like they're going to, is that both the United States and Russia will become fractured to such an extent that the Russian and American native form languages can finally begin to generate a new kind of culture in a way that they were previously unable to do. Yeah, Steiner says that like the next cultural epoch will be Russian, and then the one after that will be American. Maybe I don't know. I'm seeing a lot of things that indicate that the realization of the local geographic American form language, that is going to be happening soon. And so Steiner's definitely onto something. He's definitely seeing some very real patterns here, but I don't know if he's correct in his timeline where it's like you get 1,000 years of like Russian civilization in the same way that we had like 1,000 years of Faustian civilization, or maybe more like 500. Yeah, I guess it's more like 1,000, but in any case, yeah, and so Steiner thinks it'll be like, however long. I think it's 1,000 years of Russian, and then you'll have the American cultural epoch. I'm not really sure if that's exactly how it's going to play out, but I do see. To me, it makes more sense that it would happen simultaneously, actually. But we'll see. The bear, yeah. Spengler says it's the endless expanse of the plains, right? Um, Oh, and that's what Spengler says the Ur symbol of Faustian civilization. He says it's endless space, right? And he's on to something there. But that endless space thing, that's not specific to Faustian civilization. That is specific to the perspectival structure of consciousness, which Faustian civilization was kind of the torchbearer for. But now perspectival consciousness extends far beyond the bounds of Faustian civilization. Because it's a whole structure of consciousness unto itself. The fundamentally Faustian symbol is the spire. And I think this is common with Spengler. Spengler, he sees these things, but his capacity to really see through into things, to do this kind of envisionment, as I've called it, he's limited. He's low resolution in a lot of ways. So, for example, with the Greeks, he says that the Hellenistic Ur symbol is the male human body, right? Which is close. I mean, that's definitely very close, because the male human body is kind of an extension of this, but really more fundamentally, it's the Doric column, the phalanx, right? Phalanx. You have the battery of columns surrounding, so the Greek temple, right? You've got the battery of columns that are protecting the adytum, the inner sanctum of the temple, which is the feminine aspect, the womb, right? And so so yeah, the column, that's the significance for that. That's the core motif of Hellenistic civilization. But you can see there that in the Hellenistic civilization, that motif is still expressed in a way that is kind of pluralistic, kind of collectivistic. And then as we move into the earliest form of Faustian civilization with a Gothic spire, you can see that it's moving into a more and more individualized direction. Thank you, Soon Balloon. Thanks for the super chat. I'll post it if I don't, like, say a whole bunch of embarrassing shit or curse a lot. I've probably already broken that one, but whatever. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean by aliens, right? I mean, if you mean like biological beings that have like culture and technology and spaceships and whatnot, no, there are no aliens. If by aliens you mean, like are UFOs real? Yes, absolutely. But what are they? Well, it could be a number of things, right? You guys should definitely check out, if you're not familiar with Jacques Vallée's work, check out Passport to Magonia. Is a fantastic book in which I think he shows very clearly that a lot of the things we consider to be alien experiences are what we would otherwise call egregores or elementals. I'm iffy about using that word egregore because I've been seeing this a lot lately, that the word egregore is taken to mean like a thought form which is like generated by a collective of human beings, as though we like produce it through socialization, and that's not what that word actually means. It means the same thing as what we translate as watcher in the Hebrew Bible, right? It means something like the vigilant ones, okay, and it essentially refers to, it's kind of a broad category, but it would encompass what we would otherwise call elementals or fey beings, or autonomous complexes within Jungian psychology, that sort of thing. or dragons within Chinese mythology. These things all kind of fit into the same category, I would say. Can cultures only have or symbols if they have accessed at least magical consciousness? Human consciousness is like the magical structure is just there by default. There aren't any humans that um, lack that. Thank you, Amiriel5458, for whatever amount of money that is. Thank you. Can we get in contact somehow? If you want to contact me, you can talk to me on Discord or you can shoot me an email or whatever. Is egregore kind of like a daemon? Maybe. I mean, the thing is, these terms are used in very loosey-goosey kind of ways a lot of the time. And so it depends on who's talking, frankly. But for me, I only use the word daimon to refer to these kind of sub-organs of the human ego, which develop as we progress through the different structures. So, for example, the magical structure becomes what Freud would call the id, right? As the ego kind of buds off from that and then moves into what will become the mythical structure. And so, in other words, you end up with this kind of trail of beads left behind as the human ego progresses upward. And those beads are what I would call the daimones, right? And they're what you would call parts within internal family systems therapy. And I use the term that way because it seems to me like that's what is being implicated when Socrates talks about his daimon. I think he's talking about he's talking about what we would call the superego, effectively, which is the organ that is left over as the ego passes through the discursive structure. Archaic consciousness is everything prior to the development of human consciousness as such. Okay, and so when we look to the story of the fall from Eden, what we're seeing is the transition from archaic to magical consciousness. But we're not like any organism on our planet that is human has at least the magical structure, because that's just kind of there. Okay. Now, there's a sense in which human beings did exist even prior to that fall from Eden. Okay. And this is something I talked about in the Eden video, that really, the essence of humanity is not the physiology of what we would call Homo sapiens within biology and paleoanthropology. The essence of the human really is the evolutionary telos itself, effectively. That's really the core essence. And the bearer of that essence, you can see, is this kind of golden thread that moves through the entire history of biological life on our planet. In fact, I would say the entire history of our solar system. And we've been carrying that torch the entire time. So in that case, you could say, yes, there was a time in which there were human beings that were not in the magical structure, but as things currently stand, yes, any human being has at least that structure of consciousness, the magical structure. So, yeah. So form languages. So now there's a little bit of gray area here, though, because I think it actually is possible to have a form language before you have the I, before you have that truly ideational faculty as such, which allows for human subjectivity as such. Okay. And the example that I would point to would actually be cetaceans, dolphins, whales, orcas, because we can see that these beings actually do have language. It's like their communication systems are not just like birds chirping and dogs barking. Like there actually is a mimetic aspect to it, such that the language is at a higher level than this purely instinctual level, what I've called the sentient layer of biological organization. So once you have that kind of mimetic aspect, then the language can kind of be decoupled from the biology and from the instinctual, the ethological layer, the sentient layer. And that's kind of a precursor to truly human consciousness per se. And that kind of consciousness. So, well, actually, let me give you an example of this to illustrate exactly what I mean. Researchers who have studied cetaceans have found that sometimes these creatures form multi-species pods for hunting. So it'll be like dolphins, and I think they're called false orcas or false killer whales. It's different species of cetaceans. They'll get together and they'll form kind of a two-species pod, and they'll have a specific kind of language that they speak specifically when they're in that multi-species pod. Both species speak it to each other, but only when they're in the multi-species pod. They have a completely different way of communicating when it's just one species, right? And the two species have their own independent languages for talking to themselves, and then they have like a third language for talking to each other. So that's how we know that there is this kind of mimetic level or dianoetic level, which is more than just instinctual. And so if we then take that and then map this onto Steiner's narrative, you can see that that kind of consciousness really corresponds to the kind of consciousness that we would have had in what Steiner's calling the Lemurian epoch, right? And then the magical consciousness that would correspond to what he's calling the Atlantean epoch. So the transition between the Lemurian and Atlantean, that's the fall from Eden. And then the end of the Atlantean, that's the great flood, the deluge. Do I have any thoughts on supernatural cryptids such as dogmen, blah, 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 Sasquatch, little people? Yeah, so it seems to me that those things can be a couple of different things. One would be that they are elementals, right? So maybe like the Sasquatch is these are manifestations of like earth elementals. So this is something I talked about in the last video. How these elementals they correspond to the sentient plane or astral. So that would be the air element, right? And so you have like the physiological, and then the behavioral would be that. Okay, so they represent instincts, impulses, drives, emotional feelings, that kind of thing. And so they're kind of mapped out by the zodiac. And if you look at the different kinds of elementals, like if you look into the folklore regarding the Fae, those are air elementals. They correspond to Aquarius, Gemini, Libra. If you look at earth elementals like kobolds or gnomes or dwarves or whatever, you're going to see that they map onto Taurus and Capricorn. And so anyway, that's kind of how that works. And so a lot of the cryptids I think would fall into that category. Others, I think, might actually be something a little bit different. They actually might be something more like ghosts or phantoms, echoes of creatures that essentially diverged from us within our evolutionary history. In fact, I think that's exactly what we're seeing with the alleged hominids that are studied in paleoanthropology, right? Things like Australopithecus and so forth. These kind of primate-like human organisms. And I think that's probably also the case for the grays, the gray aliens. I think those guys are basically like ghosts of humans, really, that diverged from us sometime in the past. And specifically, I think the Atlantean epoch, which I do not, and I've talked about this before in the EPO series, but I do not believe that Atlantean civilization was this great, like technologically advanced civilization with spaceships and giant machines and things like that. I think it's the magical structure is what Gebser's calling it. Is why I'm calling it. It's definitely not a technological form of consciousness. Not even close. But nonetheless, it certainly seems to be the case that that was a form of consciousness that was able to do things with nature that we can't really do. And I think we see this everywhere with, the pyramids, within Machu Picchu, within these gigantic quarries in China. I mean, there are many, many examples of this, of the fact that human beings were once able to do things with solid stone that seem impossible to us today. But I don't think that they were doing it through anything like machine technologies, let alone modern perspectival or engine technologies, because I don't think that those things were possible. Not because people didn't know how to create them. Like it's not like they were just missing some bits of information that we figured out later on. It's not that simple. It's being able to have engine technologies, which is really what all modern technology is. It's engine technologies. You have to be able to think in terms of energy as a completely non-observable abstraction, which is not obvious at all. You don't just get that for free, right? You've got to be able to look at coal burning and water boiling and pressure building in pipes, et cetera, and to see all of those things. It's not enough to just know the facts, right? Like the ancient Greeks totally knew that you could burn coal or oil. They totally knew that heating up water causes it to boil. They totally knew that steam creates pressure. But it's not enough to just know the individual facts. You have to be able to look at all of those things and perceive something that you cannot see with your eyes, namely that there is this invisible stuff, this strange liquid that we call energy, which is continuous and moves through all of those various processes. That's what you need in order to be able to have engine technologies. And that is an extremely recent development of human consciousness. It's maybe 500 years old. Moving stones through sound resonance. I've heard this, but I've never seen anything convincing. I've seen people do things with analogy. They'll be like, ooh, use the vibrations to make the water do weird stuff. Like, yeah, that's cool. Tell me that sound, like literally vibrations of air, are able to make giant stone blocks move around. Show me. And I have never seen that. So I don't think it was that. It may be that there was something connected to that. Like, maybe they were doing something with human consciousness, doing something that was able to alter the weight or plasticity of stone that maybe involved some kind of ritual practices and chanting and music or whatever. But if it was simply a mechanical interaction between sound waves and stone, then somebody would have figured it out already. It can't be that simple. And so this is why when you look at these alternative archaeologist guys like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock, they're right to think that there was totally stuff going on in this antediluvian world that we currently don't understand, that it wasn't just a bunch of hunter-gatherer tribes. They're right about that. But then the leap they make is like, okay, well, it must have been a technologically advanced civilization. Well, that puts them in a very awkward position then, because they have a really good argument that there was stuff going on that we don't understand, just looking to the megaliths. But then when they say that there was a technologically advanced civilization, the next question is, okay, well, where are the artifacts of that technology? And there's just nothing convincing. There's nothing convincing. And so Graham Hancock, he'll say, well, maybe they had some kind of religious reason for destroying it all. Okay, and every culture on Earth had that same idea and did that same thing for the same reason. They destroyed all of their advanced technology. That's why we don't have any examples of it. And they were so successful that we don't even have a single example. See, that's what you can tell when a theory is making excuses for its own lack of evidence. That's what that is. And I'm not hating on Hancock and Carlson. I think their stuff is really interesting. But on that point specifically, that's just a bad argument. Yes, that is really what he says. Hancock specifically. I don't know if Carlson has made that specific argument, but I'm pretty sure he's made very similar arguments before. And it's a bad argument. I mean, if there's a lack of evidence, then that's a problem. Yeah, where's the evidence? They're stuck in the material. Yes, and this is why I think that Hancock is more believable when he's more woo-woo. When he's suggesting like, hey, maybe they were able to do this stuff with some kind of like consciousness techniques that we don't understand. I think that's way more plausible than the idea that they were using giant industrial saws. Because if they were, then we would have at least one example of that, and we don't. Could they be in the archaic? I don't know what this question is. Like, this is cut off from the rest of the question, I believe. I heard about a tribe in the Amazon that has only the present tense in their language, and they didn't have a religion, but looked like they were in a perpetual embodied Zen state inside. Yeah. No, it's not possible that they were in the archaic. I talk about uncontacted Amazonian tribes in one of the episodes of the EPO series. I think the second one. It's now those uncontacted tribes. They're very very illustrative because I think within these hunter-gatherer tribes like that, what you are seeing are human cultures that retain much more of the magical structure than anybody else. But nonetheless, we have to be careful with that, because that's not to say that the magical epoch, the Atlantean epoch, was simply that it was simply a world of uncontacted Amazonian tribes. That's not the case, but there are differences. There are big differences that are important. So, for example, the way that modern hunter-gatherer tribes make use of initiation rituals that are really important for kind of welding the individual ego onto this kind of tribal identity. I don't think that would have even been necessary during the magical epoch, okay? Because that form of consciousness is already familial in essence. It's already tribalistic by default. You would not need to create these kind of liminal states in order to recollectivize an ego which is trying to individuate. right? You would not be having to counteract that. And so I think the form of consciousness that would have been prevalent during the magical Atlantean epoch would have been kind of collectivistic in a way that we just don't really see in the modern world at all. And so when you look at something like Göbekli Tepe, the reason why it's such an affront to the commonly accepted narrative of human history is that the archaeologists would tell us that in order to have something like that, you have to have a labor force which can be mobilized, which means you need a sedentary society with things like written language and social hierarchy and agriculture so that you can have surpluses of food and you can organize and mobilize labor that isn't being used to hunt and yada, yada, yada. And we think that if you don't have those things, then the best you can have is like a hunter-gatherer society where the amount of bodies you're going to have on hand is going to be like 100 to 150 people, right? Prior to the Neolithic, prior to the deluge, whatever that was, I don't think that was the case at all. I think that you could have had societies much, much larger than just 150 people. I think you could have had empires because you had a very different stage of human consciousness at work that was much less individualized. Any thoughts on the Costa Rican megalithic spheres with relation to earthquake mitigation, or just big round rock makes my brain feel happy? Well, it's definitely not that. Um, I'm not sure what you mean by earthquake mitigation. I think by and large, these things like the pyramids, these megalithic structures, I think they were by and large about communing with non-human intelligences, essentially, egregores, angelic beings, dragons within China. I think, I think there are differences here that we can meaningfully chop these beings up into different categories and that they are different from one another. But if you just lump all those together, I think that's what human beings were communing with through these things. They were not they were not giant laboratory. They were not giant chemical plants. They were not power stations, power generators. Their function was strictly religious, but you have to understand that this was a time in which there was no separation between religion and human life in general. Okay. And so if you look to the Hebrew Bible yet again, you see something interesting. You have this story of the Nephilim, right? And the story is that the sons of God intermarried or interbred with the daughters of man and created the Nephilim, which are said to be giants. Now, what is this talking about? It's definitely not talking about aliens. I'm sorry, guys. It was not aliens from Nibiru or whatever that came and like literally physiologically interbred with human beings. Sons of the Elohim means spiritual beings that do not have physiological bodies. Okay. Daughters of man means they do have physiological bodies. So what's being referred to here are I believe, shamanesses, essentially, that were serving as effectively radio receivers for these kinds of intelligence. And I think it was specifically women for a reason, because I think that within that magical structure of consciousness, it is the female human consciousness which has that kind of receptivity predominantly. And again, this is because of the polarization, archetypal polarization of the male and female human beings. The female etheric body, what else would you call that? The physiomorphic layer, right? That is solar for women and lunar for men, and then it flips as you move up into the next layer, into the sentient behavioral layer. It is lunar for women and solar for men. You have this it's like two magnets that are turned upside down in relation to one another. And so again, this is something I talk about at length in one of the EPO videos. I think it was Chrysalis of the Winged Serpent. But in any case, that solar principle is receptivity to spirit, effectively. And so it makes sense that that females would be performing this kind of shamanic role within this stage of human consciousness evolution. And so they are interbreeding, as it were, with the sons of God, these egregores, elementals, whatever. And so this is why we came to develop things like agriculture and all kinds of things like that. And this is the story that's told about the Anunnaki, right? This is another interesting thing, that the Hopi Native American, their term for the ant people, the beings that came from the earth, which taught us how to do agriculture and things like that, their word for that is Anunnaki. It means something like ant friends. And then Anunnaki within Sumerian, it's the same story, only they're said to have come from the sky. And Anunnaki means the children of Anu, the sky god, and Ki, the earth mother goddess. I did not say smarter than human. Somebody might have said smarter than human. You might be responding to someone else. I think there's like a whole conversation going on in here that I'm not privy to because I am ranting and not reading all this. Virgo is the maiden. Yep. Yes, she is. You should look into the symbolism of the mind control apple in Assassin's Creed. I do not play video games, and I'm not going to, but I'm sure it's fascinating. If, say, in 150 years, there were a bioengineered being that was much smarter than a human, oh, this is what you were referring to, with denser neurons and many more of them, would it still adopt the current culture's consciousness structure? I don't think that making brains bigger or neurons denser is going to make things smarter than us. I think there's actually good reason to believe that what we have going on neurologically right now is pretty much the optimum for a biological life form. Making our brains bigger is not going to make us smarter. And it also depends entirely on what you mean by smarter. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that is my kitten, which is currently locked in my bedroom, who is going to scream at me now because he is tired of being locked in there. Anyway, yeah, I mean, what do you mean by smarter? Intelligence is one's capacity to navigate the world effectively and to flourish within whatever circumstances you have available to you. Human beings are pretty damn smart. Animals are pretty damn smart. Now, what separates us from animals is our capacity for ideational, imaginal consciousness, the fact that we can cognize forms in themselves independently of our imminent physical environments. I can conceptualize the arrowhead as something distinct from the rock in front of me, such that I can then carve the rock into the shape of the arrowhead. So that's a faculty that we have that other animals, by and large, do not. But that's not just it's not just like a sliding scale where, you've got animals over here and you slide it a bit further until you get to humans, and then you slide it a bit further and you could get to something else. It's just not that simple. Do I believe in Plato's forms? Kinda. It's a long story. Basically, yes, but it depends on what you mean by Plato's forms. Because usually, when people talk about Plato's forms, they suggest that Plato's forms are static, eternal, unchanging little crystals that exist outside of our world in this kind of hyperspace. That they are not mutable. That they're just fixed as they are. And I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that there is a reciprocal relationship between the world of forms and the world of corporeal bodily actuality, and that these two things co-inform one another. It's kind of a loop. And I think it's very questionable as to whether Plato himself actually believed in the forms being these unchanging static crystals. And yet, unfortunately, that is what we are told Platonism is. That's the way it's taught to high school students, college students. I mean, even in highbrow books about science and philosophy, you'll have people just casually say that that's what Plato believed, as though it's obvious. And then you go through the Socratic dialogues and you actually read them a little bit, and you're just like, it's not clear at all what this Plato guy actually thinks about anything. Because what he's doing is he's just setting up different positions and then knocking them down, and he never gives you a clear answer to anything, which is the point. How do I think the rest of Trump's presidency will play out, and what will it mean for the US? It's not looking good. It's not looking great. I'll come back to that. I have more to say. Do you believe that religion is a noble lie? No. Um, Now, with that said, most of what you will be told if you go into any kind of organized religious institution, if you go to a church or a Hindu temple or whatever, like the things that they're going to tell you are non-noble lies. So just lies, just falsehoods for the most part. Okay, I got to take a potty break again. Be right back. All right. So, yeah, regarding the resurrection of Jesus, I don't think it's possible to say what exactly happened historically with Jesus of Nazareth beyond that he was probably an actual historical figure. Yeah, the Shroud of Turin's an interesting story. But in any case, I mean, yeah, I mean, you're never going to really be able to say much definitively about what happened historically. It could be that the story of what actually played out historically is very, very different than what we have in the canonical and apocryphal gospels. But nonetheless, I don't think it matters. I don't think it really matters at all what did or didn't happen historically. Because if you can actually peel back the layers and see what's really going on and what's really being implicated within that narrative, then you can see that the truth it's pointing to is definitely true in terms of the theosis of the human soul. Really, that story is about the destiny of human individuality, human subjectivity. And so, um, whether this or that detail of the story that we see in the Gospels actually happened historically or not, to me is just not. It's I don't really care. It doesn't matter. How do I feel about Hermeticism? I feel like, I mean, the same thing I feel about all the different things like that. You know, you've got Hermeticism and Kabbalah and alchemy and Freemasonry and the Rosicrucians. I mean, there's um, John Dee stuff. There's good stuff sprinkled throughout all of that, but you've got to be able to read between the lines. You've got to be able to put things together in such a way that you can see what the big picture is. It's I mean, it's no different than reading the Bible or the Tibetan Book of the Dead or whatever you're into, right? Like you've got to be able to understand the language that is being spoken and what it's really talking about. James Bond is based on John Dee. Oh, I think I've heard of that before. That's funny. Oh yeah, I was going to talk more about the remainder of the Trump presidency. Well, yeah, it's looking not great, like very not great. Um, yeah, and I think this recent the guy the nurse who got killed like that, that's looking really not good because the first one, that lady who was killed, you could kind of frame that as like, oh, this, she's a liberal, she's woke, this is like a left versus right thing with the, some Karen getting her, shot by this neo-reactionary Trump supporting MAGA person. Um, and you could tell the story like that from either side of the fence. But this more recent thing is not like that. The guy was uh, legally, he legally had a gun on him. He clearly was not even trying to defend himself. Um, it's really hard to look at this as left versus right, or anything like that. It just appears to be just grotesque, really. And I think this is, something that we're seeing across the board, especially with the Epstein thing, is that the people who uh, would otherwise have been on board with Trump, these kind of, the disenfranchised young white man archetype, uh, these guys are very quickly, I think, coming to see that Trump uh, is not what they wanted him to be, and frankly, the guy, Donald Trump. I mean, I think he's losing his mind. Frankly, I don't know if you guys have seen those plaques that he put up in the White House. That's that to me looks like psychosis. That's not just hubris. That's not just egotism or narcissism. That looks to me like somebody who is, um his fantasy world is becoming disconnected from reality in a way that is alarming. Yeah, yeah, second term Reagan levels of, mental decline. Yeah, he's losing it. Prison Planet Gnostic Doomers. Yeah, not about it. Yeah, the whole idea. In fact, um, the word Gnosticism unfortunately kind of has a bad rap because it's usually used to refer to this idea that, like, the material world is like a hell world, and we're like trapped here, and the goal is to, like, get out, and you can't trust your senses because the world we encounter imminently is not really real. And I'm not on board with any of that. Now, does that really describe Gnosticism across the board? Does that describe all of the different forms of paleo Christianity, which are usually described as Gnostic? No, not necessarily. In fact, I think there's a lot of good stuff in Gnosticism. That, however, I am vehemently opposed to for various reasons, um, especially epistemologically. Because I think that is completely antithetical to the envisionary epistemology, which I have made my entire life's mission to advocate for. Because that kind of, envisionary insight, seeing through things into these deeper realities, the noumenal, that, okay, is something that does not involve dissociating from your sensory perception of the world. No, quite the contrary. It means being with the phenomena and in a more intimate way, being more connected to that which is available to our senses, to that which is actually there empirically, right? So what I'm calling envisionary perception goes right hand in hand with what William James or Alfred North Whitehead would call radical empiricism. And in fact, I think it's the only way that empiricism as such can actually realize its ultimate destiny. It's not just that consciousness is this thing that science has, failed to acknowledge, right? It's something that science actually cannot deal with because of its the conceptual contradictions in its own epistemological foundations. And so, in order for science to actually be fully true to its own empiricism, to its own epistemological ground, it has to become esoteric science. Um, Otherwise, science becomes unscientific. It detaches from reality, and you end up with this nonsense. Bully me into going back to practicing for tomorrow's signals and systems exam. Okay, I will try. Let's start with this. College is a scam. Hope that helped. Anyway, Gospel of Philip and Mary are not dualistic, but actually pretty platonically monistic. Usually people interpret the Gospel of Mary as very dualistic, but I mean, the thing is, like with these, there's always many different ways you can turn these things around when we're talking about spiritual texts and symbols and things like that. So, I mean, personally, I'm inclined, I think the way that this should be approached is you should take the Gospels, including all of the Apocrypha, regardless of where it came from, and you should read the damn things. And if you get something from it, good. And if it says something that you don't agree with, then that's fine. So, like, for example, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he says that people are living in sin if they remarry after their spouse dies and they become a widow. And the thing is that everybody just kind of ignores him saying that because it's just kind of a silly and ridiculous thing to say. And that's because it's a silly and ridiculous thing to say. But if Jesus Christ of Nazareth was a human being, then that's what you would expect. You would expect him to have said silly and ridiculous things from time to time. I am not obligated to think that every word out of his mouth was literally the word of God. Or alternatively, you could say it is literally the word of God because the human soul is the Christos is the mirror image of the Godhead and blah blah blah. But then everything out of everyone's mouth is the word of God, and every word out of everybody's mouth should be taken as equally with a grain of salt. Thoughts on Peterson? I think Peterson. I think Peterson is limiting. I think, and I think we've seen this a lot lately with a lot of people who were Peterson fans, who kind of segued out of atheist materialism through Peterson. They've ended up finding Peterson very lacking, and a lot of them have ended up becoming ortho bros, converting to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is a dead end, unfortunately. I hate to say it to you, ortho bros, but you're not going to find what you're looking for in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Sorry. I plan on making a whole video about that, actually, so I'm not going to go on about that right now. But yeah, Peterson, his fans often just kind of end up using him as kind of a segue and finding his philosophy to be kind of deficient because he tries to root everything in mainstream academic psychology in such a way that he doesn't have to make any kind of metaphysical commitments. And so there's only so far you can go with that. And furthermore, his interpretation of Christianity is strained. I think most interpretations of Christianity are strained, but for him in particular, it's very obvious that, like, when it comes to the Old Testament, this idea of Yahweh as like a Jovian, Zeus, Marduk, like sky father deity, like that he gets. But then, of course, with the Christ narrative, you have this movement beyond that, and he struggles with it, because it's really hard for him to square that with his, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, bucko type of thing. Peterson is too entwined with Jung to see Christianity clearly. I don't think it's Jung. I don't think it's Jung. I think Jung's interpretation of Christianity is way better than Peterson's is. I mean, his is missing too. Jay Dyer. I do not like that guy. I'm sorry. I really do not like Jay Dyer. I think he is just the kind of person who just he does not take himself seriously, and therefore I refuse to take him seriously. He's like the Professor Dave of the ortho bro world. That's how I see Jay Dyer. I do not like him. He really gets off. I watched a couple of videos by him recently because somebody has sent me an email like, "Oh, you should check out this guy," which is not to. I don't want to talk smack about whoever sent me that email. I don't remember the person's name, but it doesn't matter. I shouldn't be saying it on live stream anyway. Nothing against you, whoever you are, if you're out there listening to this, but I watched just a couple of videos, and like the guy is just such a child. I mean, he's got to be my age, right? Like he's got to be in his 30s, and he acts like a fucking 13-year-old, and it's really just kind of gross and off-putting, and I am not a fan. Anyway. Oh yeah, I like Vervaeke. Oh, that was an epic voice crack right there. Don't vape, kids. Anyway. Yeah, professor, not actually a Professor Dave. Yeah, John Vervaeke's cool. In fact, I almost met him. I missed him by like a few days when I was at the Party Center in Italy. He had like just left when I got there. I'll probably run into him at some point. That would be cool. Is Professor Dave Ahriman? Nah. Nah, he's just a grown man who is actually 13 years old mentally. There's a lot of those, unfortunately. Professor Zhang is pretty interesting. I think he overextends his like game theory style approach to where he likes to make everything into this kind of like cost benefit calculation, which works, I think, when you're talking about things at a geopolitical level, especially because he's so willing to intermix it with this more like symbolic, archetypal type psychological stuff. And it works really well. But sometimes when he's talking about like why individual human beings or even groups of human beings do things, I think he leans on that a little too heavily, and it doesn't really account for like the fact that the human mind is not really a cost benefit analysis machine. You know what I mean? Like we're a lot more subtle than that, but yeah, I mean, no, I mean his videos are very entertaining. I listen to him at work all the time. He teaches high school? That's crazy. Yeah, I'm sorry, Americans. We're fucked. If that's what they're teaching Chinese kids in high school, yeah, we're fucked. Yeah, I really like Chris Brennan, the astrology podcast. It's very good. I really like that he has this very rigorous kind of methodical approach to what he does. It makes his videos hard to watch sometimes because he's so methodical, but at the same time, it's a lot better than most you look up astrological topics, most people online are just like very airy fairy about it. Um, and It's kind of hard to take it seriously sometimes. Brennan is worth taking seriously because he takes what he does very seriously. In high school, I got taught that my history teacher accidentally did opium in India. I got news for you. It was not accidental. What's my favorite band right now? Um, do I have a favorite band right now? I'm not sure. When I was younger, I used to be such a music geek. Like I would get an album, buy a band, and I would just listen to the album, just start to finish. Like, I mean, that's how I consume the music. There was no just like putting it on shuffle. It's like I took the disc, put it in the CD player, and listened to the whole thing. And I would usually have like one band that I was like really obsessed with at any given time. Like for a while, I was really into Mission of Burma. That's a good one. Neutral Milk Hotel at one point. I got to see them live, actually. That was awesome. Tool when I was like 15 years old. Modest Mouse. I was really into Modest Mouse at one point. I mentioned that Hindus and Buddhists are just lies. No, 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 no. I mean any organized religion in general, not specifically Hindus and Buddhists. Um, Could you go into how the angels work, including how they work into each epoch of anthroposophy? Okay, so that I'm getting there. I promise. That's part of this big, gigantic, what was once upon a time the ever present origin series. Now, I guess it's just the Formscape series now. I'm getting to that. But it's something where like I have to do it methodically or it's just not going to make sense. I could, I don't even have a whiteboard, but I could whip out a whiteboard right now and start drawing diagrams to try and show you how that works. But it's not, you're not really going to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying unless it's within the context of a much bigger story I'm trying to tell. But I guess just to give you a snippet, if you look at the celestial hierarchy as described by Pseudo-Dionysius and Rudolf Steiner, it's 9 altogether, right? And it forms a 3x3 grid. If you understand what the elements are actually referring to, you can see that 3x3 grid is actually an elemental grid, right? So you have, and you're missing an element too, and that's interesting. So it's fire, air, earth. Water isn't a part of it. But water is a part of it when we're talking about things like elementals and egregores and whatnot and biological beings. Okay, so the angels are in a kind of category all their own in that regard. and that the water element isn't there. And explaining why is a long story. But in any case, you get the fire, air, earth, okay, across, and then so you have an X and Y axis, fire, air, earth, right? And so the seraphim would be like fire, fire, okay? And then the cherubim are like air, fire. And then the ophanim are like earth, fire, okay? And if you understand what that's indicating, then you go back and you listen to what Steiner says about how, like, oh, the Elohim are spirits of form, and so they're responsible for this and that. It all starts to click together, and you'll start to see exactly why he's saying a lot of the stuff that he's saying. It doesn't seem like he's just coming up with stuff anymore. Though frankly, sometimes I think Steiner is just kind of coming up with stuff. Sounds like the trigrams. Well, I mean, in the sense that the trigrams are the trigrams are just different combinations of yin and yang, right? And you end up with oh, I forget how many trigrams, but if you take the trigrams and you arrange them along the tree of life, and again, this is something I'll illustrate in a video essay once I get to that part of the story, but you can set up the trigrams so that you basically have like two for each structure of consciousness moving up the tree of life. And so there's that. How did I get into esotericism? I kind of never did. I started off really into evolutionary biology and specifically marine biology. And man, it's just such a long story. It's such a long, winding story of how I developed intellectually over the course of 20 years. But the esotericism stuff, it just kind of happened. Like there was never really a point where I was like, oh, I'm going to be interested in esotericism now. Like I was never interested in the occult. I'm still kind of not, to be completely, like um I don't have any crystals. I have a deck of tarot cards now. They're actually the Crowley, like Thelema tarot cards, because a friend gave these to me. Prior to that, I had never touched a deck of tarot cards. I knew mythology, and I knew quite a bit about religious history, but it was really it was several things is the thing. I can't really point to one specific thing that kind of opened up the doors for me because I mean, it really started with Nietzsche. That was my break from scientism, mechanistic physicalism. That started with Nietzsche. And then I got kind of further opened up to that, to the more woo-woo stuff through Heidegger, actually. And then it was really Whitehead. Whitehead was like a major door opener for me. But since then, I mean, you guys have probably noticed if you watch my video essays that I haven't really talked about Whitehead very much in a long time. And it's because my own metaphysics has drifted further and further away from Whitehead over time. To the point that I don't really use his terminology very much anymore because I've kind of got my own thing going on. Why has identity politics been moving to the forefront of political discussion as of late? That's been happening for a long time, man. That's been happening since the 90s at least. So By unless you mean 35 years, 36 years by of late, then you're kind of late to that party. That's been going on for a while. And here's the thing: nationalistic, racial advocacy, and wokeism are just two different kinds of identity politics. Could astrology explain why? Astrology does not explain anything. Okay, and this is actually something very important. Um, you see astrological correlations with processes that are happening in our world. Okay, and so looking to astrology can kind of give you a window into these higher level forces that are shaping our world. Okay, but the planets, the stars, they do not cause things to happen. Okay. If you are fighting with your romantic partner, I promise you that Venus retrograde is not causing that to happen. That is happening because y'all got problems. And that might be correlated with, Venus retrograde on your descendant or whatever the fuck. Um, but as soon as you start looking at that astrological stuff as though it is actually causing things to happen, well, then that's going to result in you becoming a rather toxic person, because then you're not going to take your partner seriously, that they're angry at you. You're going to be like, oh, well, they're not angry at me because of actually, real concerns that they have about my behavior. No, it's Venus that's making them do it. Do not be that person. Do not be that person. Dehumanizing and removes the personal connection with your partner. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, it's just a way of completely dismissing things within interpersonal problems, and I've seen that a lot with people who are into astrology. Touch grass. Keep yourself grounded in reality, the real bodily world that you are actually experiencing. I cannot emphasize this enough for you guys. I did not come onto YouTube to become the guru for a bunch of occultist and esoteric people. I was really making videos for people interested in science and philosophy, and the algorithm gave me you guys instead, so you're stuck with me. Hate it for you. But people who are interested in this kind of stuff are people who have a propensity towards fantasies and delusions. Okay? And you need to be aware that you might have a vulnerability in that regard. All of us, myself included. Be careful with that. What does zodiacal energies really do then? Like, if you were to explain it in only one phrase, how would you explain it? Do not ask me to explain anything in one phrase, first of all. Like, my videos are 2.5 hours long for a reason. Um, but I mean, okay, so the zodiac, for example. I mean, when you look at a person's natal chart, okay, you've got the planets, you've got the zodiac, you've got a snapshot of a bunch of waves, okay, that constitute the song that is that person's psychical composition and their bodily composition. Okay. And so you got to understand that when you're looking at whatever it is, Libra, Scorpio, whatever, you're looking at different forces within that person. Okay. And we're swimming in those forces, those currents, those waves, okay, are all around us. They move through everything in our world, and they are synchronized with the heavens. But the heavens are not doing things to us. That's not how it works. And so this is why a lot of people who are skeptical of astrology, they'll be like, "Oh, what's the causal mechanism?" They've already got it twisted from the very beginning. The causal mechanism, it's not a mechanism. There's a very important ontological distinction between organic organization and mechanical organization, first of all, but the organismic cause that results in those synchronizations being the case is that our entire world is organized organically into a whole, right? The different parts of your body are synchronized with one another because they form a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. And the same goes with the planets of our solar system and the moon. And the zodiac then is an extension of that, because really what the zodiac is it's dividing the sky, and dividing the sky based on the is it the equinoxes? I think it's the equinoxes, right? And then so you get this 12-fold division that maps onto the seasons. And most people are confused about this. They think that the sidereal zodiac came first and then the tropical zodiac came later, and that's actually not the case. The tropical came first, and then the sidereal zodiac came about because Indian astrologers who were primarily using a kind of lunar based astrology started incorporating the tropical zodiac, but they mapped it onto the stars themselves rather than to the so it maps onto the divisions or divisions of the sky of the stars rather than divisions based on the equinoxes and the seasons. And they did that because you kind of have to do that to make it synergize with all that stuff with like the lunar mansions, Kamaloka, all that jazz. So, which is not to say that tropical is better than sidereal or vice versa. It's you're just looking at different layers of organization, and so it's just you're going to see different things depending on which system you use. I've heard a lot of people within the astrology world try to explain it as like, oh, the tropical is more towards your embodied life and the sidereal is more about your soul at a cosmic level, or they'll say something like that. Sure, whatever. I've never heard an explanation like that actually seemed to make sense to me, that I could actually be like, oh, okay, I can actually see that tropical is doing this and sidereal is doing that, and that there's a tangible difference between the two of them. So I don't know if they're really I don't know what a categorical difference between the two of them would really look like. Sidereal is subconscious. Sure, whatever. I mean, you can say that, but like when you look at sidereal astrology and actually start using it, like, is that actually what's going on? Is it that sidereal astrologers are only talking about people's subconscious and then tropical is only talking about people's conscious? I don't see that. It seems to me like both are talking about both. And that goes with any of these ways that people try and chop it up, like, oh, sidereal is about this and tropical is about that. I've never heard a framing of that like seemed to actually work. Because it's like no matter what, no matter how you try to cut it up, if you say sidereal is this, well then okay, but so is tropical. You can say, oh well, tropical is this, well so is sidereal. Like there's Like explanations like that just don't work for me just because they sound good coming out of your mouth. Right? Like I have to actually be able to see, okay, this is a concrete difference between the two, and I've never seen anything like that. Moon is more important than sun in sidereal. Now that's true. That's now that could maybe point in the direction of saying that like sidereal pertains more to like a relational sense of selfhood, whereas the tropical is more of a solar, more individualistic frame of reference. Maybe, but again, I can say that and it sounds good, but it's not true unless you can really see it happening, and that there actually is a real difference there. Rudolf Steiner, I think, says we need to find out how true reality works through spiritual science, which requires spiritual vision, though, and then we will know what to do. Yeah, well, here's the thing. The spiritual vision that Steiner is talking about is the envisionment that I'm talking about. That's all it is. It is not this state of like altered consciousness that you achieve through, like, it's not anything like taking an entheogenic substance, tripping on shrooms or meditating yourself into some kind of dissociative state until you close your eyes and you see angels flying around. No, it's not that. Look at what Steiner actually says. Look at the way that he started off as the editor and annotator of Goethe's scientific works. It was in Goethe's scientific works that he saw the epistemological basis for what he would come up with this idea of like spiritual perception. And it's not anything like that. It is nothing other than a refinement of perception and thinking. It is something that you do in broad daylight, sober as a judge, eyes wide open. Okay. And so it's not something like we're sitting around waiting for the gods to come down and hand us this new form of consciousness. No, it is something that you can do right now if you put in the work. Simple as that. It is not something that you achieve by becoming this like enlightened spiritual guru. Anybody can do it. The envisionary stage involves basically taking agency over one's imagination by apprehending the way we form images within the mind. Well, that's part of it. It's a very big part of it is internalizing the conceptualization faculty of the human mind, which is predominantly what the right hemisphere does. And so it's coming to experience the activity of the right hemisphere as something that the ego is actively doing rather than something that is simply happening to us. Okay. And you can see this process playing out historically, and it's a long story that I'm not going to reiterate here. Watch the EPO series, but I mean, you see it with the nominalists, the medieval scholastic nominalists, and this and you see this trajectory playing out where we're increasingly coming to see ideas, concepts, forms as things inside of us that we're projecting out onto the world rather than things that are just simply there waiting for us. And the way that you get to that envisionary stage is realizing, yes, my mind is actively disclosing forms within my experience, but forms are actually out there as well because they're these composites. They're these hyperdimensional objects, if you want to say it that way. They contain multiplicities because they contain all of the potential for phenomenological particularity. So they're like composite images. They're like these nebulas of potentiality. Okay. And that envisionary perception is learning to turn things around in your mind so that you start to see those orphenomen, as Goethe would say, within that which is available to your ordinary senses because it's all already there. All you're doing is pattern recognition, but you're doing it in a way that has not been possible for most of human history because of that internalization of that right hemisphere function. Look at Goethe. Look at the way that Goethe was able to see the Orpflans within plant life. Think about what's happening there. He's literally compositing the phenomenological in such a way that the overall pattern reveals itself, and the way that that overall pattern contains all of the particularity within the phenomena that he observed. It's the same thing with his color wheel, right? And so what I've tried to do is to deepen that by seeing that pattern that's there in the color wheel is also there within the organization of the planetary archetypes. Okay, so this is something I'm going to be really getting into in the next couple of videos. That there are these basic structures, these basic maps that are omnipresent throughout nature. And his color wheel is kind of the crude form of one of them. But really there are four maps. You've got the crucifix, you've got the tree of life, the Taurus, you've got the zodiac, and then you've got the color wheel, the chromogram. And those four give you those are basically maps of the different compositional layers, the basic structural motifs of those different compositional layers. When Goethe saw the Orpflans, he saw it. He saw that it was present in the plants. He did not come up with it. He simply allowed the phenomena to be there, present, and when he says, "Look not beyond the phenomena for a theory," the phenomena are the theory. What he's saying is that the theory, the orphenomen, simply is the structure of relationality that is already there within the phenomena. Right? So again, it's just pattern recognition, really. It's already there, but we have to disclose it. And that disclosure is a kind of recognition. You could even call it a kind of memory, couldn't you? Right? Anamnesis. How can we realize this? Think. Think. Study philosophy, study science. Shed all of your dogmas. Look at things. Look at them carefully. Grand narrative is another way to say archetypal. Yeah, I don't know about that. A grand narrative is a kind of archetype. I don't think it goes the other way. An archetype is a motif. It is a certain region of conceptual formative space. How far can we go with this? Pretty damn far. Because that internalization that we're able to achieve now, that envisionary faculty, that development, then allows us to raise up into consciousness, into the sphere of conscious volition, everything else that's going on within the human organism. Right? we are like these beehives of autonomous complexes, elementals, egregores, what have you, daimones, these different entities, as it were, that make up our behavioral patterns, emotional patterns, thought forms, etc. And most of those just kind of go about their business in this kind of automatic, instinctual way. But once we can begin to perceive them for what they are, then we can begin to raise all of that into conscious awareness and begin to become the conductor of that orchestra. And I mean, this is what Jungian and Freudian psychodynamics are really trying to move us towards. I would say the same thing about internal family systems therapy and the Enneagram. Within Gattaean science, how is a false theory identified from a true theory? I mean, the true theory is that which is actually there, present within the phenomena. A false theory is when that is not the case. I mean, it's it's basically how you think empirical science works. When you're just told, oh, you just look at the world, and then the way the world fits together. That's your theory, right? Like that's how we naively, optimistically think regular, academic science should operate. And then, of course, once you start actually studying and peeling back the layers and going through the dirty laundry, you start to realize that that is not how academic science works at all. But I mean, it's essentially that, if the theory, quote unquote, is not there in the relationships between the phenomena, then it's just not there. Simple as that. Nothing is hidden. So, so yeah, and this is, I mean, this is, and I really started really seeing the light about that kind of thing after I finished the Noetic Ether series, because I put so much effort into those videos, and then by the time they were done, I was just like, I don't like this. Like, it just doesn't. Like, I stand by a lot of the things I said in those videos. Don't get me wrong, but there was something about it that just didn't work for me. It felt like so unnecessary and so off to be speculating about these, you know, uh, alternating positive and negative waves of these little BBs. And I felt like I was just saying all this stuff about stuff that I can't actually see. And I was like, well, it just felt wrong. And ultimately, that was when I started getting really into Goethe's stuff and specifically into Steiner's epistemological interpretations of Goethe's scientific works. And then I was like, oh, okay, there's nothing hidden. There's no need to posit these invisible things that aren't actually there, and then projecting them out onto the world as though, if we had just built a big enough microscope, we could see them. No, it's not that. It's not that our microscopes aren't big enough. It's a category mistake. It's taking an abstract idea and then treating it as though it is an observable empirical reality. That's the issue with all kinds of atomistic thinking. All right. What is the ontology of a world of forces called? I have no idea what you're talking about. The pleroma? When someone proposes something like an electron, it's really simply a mathematical relationship and not a real physical thing, but there is a real relationship. What is the relationship? Well, I mean, in that case, an electron is just a measurement. That's all you can say if that's all you're working with, right? It's just and all of those measurements are just electromagnetism, right? It's just you've got one electromagnetic field that is perturbed, and you're like, aha, that was an electron. Well, what was the electron? It was the perturbation of the electromagnetic field. That's all you can actually say because that's all you've actually got empirically. So if you want to go further than that, then you've got to let go of this physicalistic notion that the world is made out of little BBs. I think that if science is going to be scientific at all, it has to let go of both physicalism and instrumentalism. Because instrumentalism, when all said and done, it just ends up being a thing where you're essentially defining truth, quote unquote, as that which, makes profit for shareholders. I mean, that ends up being what it is ultimately. But again, you don't actually have to stop there, right? That because that truth isn't really truth. You can't actually make any claim to that being the reality that's actually out there. So all you can say is, well, it works, by a very, very truncated definition of works. If you want the actual truth, you've got to be able to say, okay, this is what's actually out there, right? And again, with like the Orpflons, with Goethe, that's a real pattern. And that real pattern is actually at work in shaping plant life. That is the actual noumenal reality, part of the noumenal reality that's actually out there beyond us. Material isn't real. It's light and force that act across a seemingly empty space. I I don't know what that means. Material is definitely real. Physical reality is definitely real, but it's just not made out of little BBs. Yeah, I would say that mathematics is already something that is showing us part of the architecture of the pleroma. How do I explain optical illusions? Well, it's funny that you should ask because that's actually a very important part of my narrative. Watch the video called The Formscapes Manifesto. I talk about optical illusions, quote unquote, at length. Um, what those optical phenomena actually show us is that things in the world are defined through relationality. Okay. Manifestations are defined through relationality. And there is also always multiplicity behind that. There's also a plurality of possible relationships that underlie the concrete, tangible relationships we see in the phenomenological. Okay. So, a good example, music is great for illustrating all of this. But music, for example, if you take just any note and play it, okay, well, what note is that? Well, it's nothing by itself. It's just a certain frequency. It doesn't have any color. It doesn't have any harmonic quality to it if it's just one note, right? But then you can contextualize it, right? You can play a note, a perfect fifth down, or a perfect fourth below it, or you can, and so the way that you add in other notes around it, which contextualize it, completely changes the color of that note, right? So what's going on there? What's the underlying reality of the musical form? The underlying reality is the harmonic object, okay, which would be in this case a certain mode, a certain scale. Really, musicology, I would say, is the first truly and visionary science because of the way that the musical objects which it investigates, they're exactly what I'm talking about by orphenomen, right? Or auras, psychical objects. That's really what those musical objects are, like modes or scales or chords or whatever. And so that mode of inquiry is exactly what I'm talking about. And mathematics too. People. I've heard people before talk about Goethe and science as though it's somehow like anti-mathematical. No, it's not. In fact, Goethe specifically says that his methodology is mathematically rigorous. It should actually look like mathematical derivation in the way that you're taking the phenomena and kind of extracting something that's already in there. Right. So again, you get one side of the equation and then the equal sign, and then whatever you've got on the other side has to already be there on the other side of the equation. Right. And so Goethe sees his method of seeing the orphenomen as fundamentally actually the exact same thing as what we're doing in mathematics. And so it's one way of putting it, I think, is a very good way of putting it. You could say that envisionment is making imagination rigorous in the same way that mathematics is rigorous. I mean, that's what it is. Music has a supernatural component. Well, no, it's just it is super sensory already. All of it. It's not that there's a component of it that's supernatural. I mean, I don't really like the word supernatural at all, honestly. But super sensory, you could say. When you hear music of any kind, you're not hearing notes. Your mind is not identifying specific frequencies. It's identifying relationships between them so that it can then identify musical gestures, musical motifs, musical movements. That's what you're actually perceiving, which is always something that is behind the specific frequencies. You're not hearing the specific frequencies. Unless you have perfect pitch, you're not going to be able to tell me what frequencies are happening. Even if you have perfect pitch, that's you're not going to be able to say much other than identifying, specific notes. I mean, but the notes are more than that. You have, take a frequency range like spectrometer thing, or like an equalizer where it shows you the full band of a single note. There's so many different frequencies, even a single note. Nobody with perfect pitch is going to be able to map all that out. You don't hear that. You hear the gesture, the motif, the idea. You are perceiving the form. Okay. But you're not doing it with your conscious mind for the most part. You're mostly doing it with your instinctual, sentient, astral body. It's kind of doing that perception for you. Same thing with color. When you see color, you are seeing relationships. They're really harmonic relationships between light and darkness. Okay. It's the same thing with music. So that's something that your body is already doing for you, just kind of instinctually, right? So what I'm talking about is the human mind, the conscious mind, coming to be able to do that actively, voluntarily. Creatively, yes. Speech is similar. Yes, yes, it is. I know you said you don't take personal questions, but I don't remember saying that, but okay. But I am now curious, how do you go about having a rigorous process of envisionment? I mean, this is something that I just came about through, I mean, my entire life, really. You know, I started reading voraciously when I was like 12 years old, and I never stopped. And again, I've gone through many, many different kind of phases of being interested in different kinds of philosophy and science and whatnot. But ultimately, this is something that I just kind of developed without realizing I was developing it. And then once I started to realize what it was, when I started studying Goethe and Steiner and started to see what was really going on in the big picture, then it became something that um, I started really thinking about and really um, trying to make it into a methodology, an epistemological principle. But in reality, it's something that I had already started doing, gradually over the course of many years. And you talk about the impulse to go live in the woods. Yes, I would not recommend it. You're probably going to die. When was my quantum mechanics phase? I always kind of felt like quantum mechanics was mostly, if not entirely, bullshit. So I don't think I really had a quantum mechanics phase. Closest thing to that would have been when I was working on the noetic ether videos. For people who tip, you can add your questions to the threads on the tip. Wait, when I click on these things, what happens? Oh, when you tip, it makes a thread. Eh. Nobody taught me how to YouTube, guys. I'm just kind of figuring this stuff out as I go. What do you think about areas like gender studies, critical race theory, decolonial studies, and other college degrees of leftist ideology? I don't know. I can tell you for certain that nothing you have ever heard about critical race theory is about anything, because critical race theory is like this really deep in the woods, like stuff that came out of like Frankfurt School and like legal philosophy, and it's just a whole like super duper duper niche kind of sort of postmodernist philosophy. And so um the most I can say about that is that the people who for a while there, I haven't heard this in a while, but for a little while there was a lot of like conservatives who were like, oh, critical race theory, and they were making it into some kind of boogeyman. And I'm just like, you people definitely have no idea what that actually is, because I barely even have any idea what that actually is. I mean, that's stuff where you have to study post-Marxian structuralism, and it's just like really, really, really niche. And I don't really have like an opinion on it, except to say that the people talking about it are people who definitely don't know what they're talking about. Now, as for like gender studies, I would say that it's like pretty much entirely bullshit. I mean, gender studies tends to lean very heavily into this kind of deconstructionist. I hate using that word because it's not even what Derrida originally meant by the word deconstruction, but whatever. This very anti-realist kind of thing where gender is just like a social construct and the result of these like power relations, and it's just silly and stupid in my opinion. Gender is a very real thing in the real world. And yeah, I don't have anything positive to say about gender studies. I think if we're going to actually study gender, then the first thing to do would be to take seriously gender as a real phenomena in the real world, and they can't even do that. So so is gender and its expression static? I don't even know what that means. What was the other one? Gender studies, CRT, oh, decolonial studies. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, all of these really have, oh, I don't know about CRT, but certainly gender studies and decolonial studies, these are research programs that have a very blatant political agenda that conditions everything they do, which I think is kind of gross. Um, now, I mean, decolonial studies also often involves, kids having to read, writers from Africa and Indonesia and China and that kind of thing. And good that they're doing that. But again, it's always packaged in this way that has this very blatant kind of political spin that I think is pretty gross. Gender studies guys had was an examination of how gender is performed. However, the gender denialism was stupid. Yeah, I mean, gender is a complex phenomenon, but in order to understand a complex phenomena, you need to first acknowledge that it's real, and then understand that its reality involves different interlocking parts that make it what it is. And yeah, it's true that it can express itself in different ways in different kinds of contexts, but that goes for literally everything in the real world. That's not news. So, and some gender related norms are bad. And some gender related norms are a good thing that are based on very real differences between people. Like, for example, young women should probably not walk in dark alleys by themselves late at night without, having something like pepper spray or a way to contact help, because that could go very badly. That is a solid, concrete fact about reality. That is not something invented by some sort of ideology. That's just part of how the real world works. And unfortunately, the people within that kind of postmodern leftist academic world, they have a lot of trouble acknowledging that reality is like this hard, solid thing that doesn't really care about their political ideals. Yeah. Oh, I'm so brave for stating what, every other rad trad YouTuber would say. I'm trying to be a little bit more nuanced than that. I mean, there's so many conservative YouTubers, who will just be like, gender studies is evil and the postmodernists ruined art and blah, blah. And they just, they try to make it into this boogeyman. And it's like, well, actually, I think that Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko are interesting and worth talking about, and maybe weren't actually just agents of Satan, but whatever. And the same thing with, like, they'll make postmodernism into this boogeyman type thing, and it's like, um, I actually like Michel Foucault quite a lot. He was probably a perverted psychopath in his personal life, but I mean, Discipline and Punish is a good book. In fact, Derrida, he's considered to be one of like the arch postmodernists. What he actually is talking about when he talks about deconstruction as a kind of method of textual analysis, like that's very close to what I'm calling envisionary perception. Actually, if you actually look into what he's talking about, what he actually meant by deconstruction. And Deleuze, I mean, I have issues with Deleuze, but his stuff is interesting too. So it's like, who are the evil postmodernist philosophers who don't believe that anything is real and everything is relative, and they're trying to destroy Western civilization? Because I don't really see that when I read the guys who tend to be called postmodernists. So where's the boogeyman, right? Maybe it's in the gender studies courses. I don't fucking know. Do you have any thoughts on Nick Land? Yeah. I don't know. Like Nick Land, I don't see the appeal, frankly. Like I don't think he's saying anything interesting that wasn't already said by like Nietzsche and Deleuze, first of all. Um and beyond that, like it's like, his idea of like hyperstition, and his pneumogram stuff. It's like he doesn't actually believe in a metaphysical reality. He does not actually believe in a form space or pleroma, and so he thinks it's all just stuff that people are just kind of like making up, like fantasies. But then the fantasies have a reality of their own that shapes the world, and so it's kind of like this chaos magic type of thing. But I just fundamentally disagree with that because I believe that there is a really real world out there that does have this archetypal constitution to it. And so when Nick Land is talking about the pneumogram, he basically just made it up. He made up the whole thing as this kind of chaos magic thing. When I'm talking about the tree of life, I don't think that I made that up. I did not make that up. That's real. And I'm not just saying that because, you can see it in ancient Egypt and Kabbalah and all that. Like, no, it's like you can see it in the world if you know what you're looking at. It exists in reality. So yeah, I mean, Nick Land, he's an anti-realist in that regard. And so whatever, when he talks about AI and capitalism and he's describing Ahriman, right? What Steiner would call Ahriman, this all devouring virtual labyrinth thing. And I think the way that he describes it is correct for the most part. But the thing is that Nick Land, because he's a Nietzschean, he thinks that will to devour is like the fundamental eros of reality itself, and that all of life and all the complexity we see in the world is just spiraling towards this entropic self-extinguishment. And so it's this very nihilistic, very kind of grotesque sort of thing. And I can see why people would like it, because it's like, ooh, it's like philosophy, but like Lovecraftian. And so it appeals to, like, your doomer edgelord kids. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, I can only hope that the people who get into Nick Land segue into more realist forms of metaphysics, which is often what happens with people who get into like Deleuze or like Ken Wilber, for example. Greatest thanks to your work making your down to earth content. Ever considered a video on Mormonism? Personally, I find it fascinating. Eclectic slurry of all sorts of esotericism, not just masonry and Christian mysticism. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. I'm not really going to answer the question, because I mean, like, in order to make a video on Mormonism, I would have to have like a damn good reason to do so, and I'm not immediately seeing that. But there's this weird thing. I remember hearing about this a long time ago, where like this idea that Mormons believed that, what was it? It was like Native Americans were like the lost tribe of Israel or some shit. And it was like, oh, wacky Mormons believing wacky Mormon things, hee hee ha ha. And then it turns out like there's this whole gigantic rabbit hole regarding Cherokee Indians having like Jewish DNA, and like it's a whole thing. You guys have to look into this. The oh, what is that? Oh, I forget what it's called. The It's a podcast that usually covers like esoteric stuff. I forget what they're called. Anyway, I'll find it and post about it on the Discord or whatever. But anyway, yeah, there's like this whole thing where like these Cherokee people were getting their DNA tested because they were um part of the tribe. Their parents and grandparents were Cherokee. I mean, and they were getting their DNA tested, and it was coming back that they weren't Native American at all, because the DNA tests were looking for this like East Asian haplogroup or whatever, and it wasn't there. And instead, it was coming back that they were not only did they have Jewish DNA, but more Jewish DNA than most European Jewish people. And anyway, that opens up this gigantic can of worms, with like these artifacts found in the Americas with like Hebrew writing on them, and of course they're dismissed as hoaxes. But then there's a whole bunch of them, and it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing, and it makes me wonder, because I just kept on thinking like, wait, don't the Mormons believe that? I don't know much about Mormonism. I don't know if this like synergizes with their story very well or whatever, but crazy stuff. And then you have all this stuff with like the Great Lakes copper mining culture, even though apparently none of the Native Americans had metal smelting technologies. And it just and the Olmec heads, and the fact that they look awfully West African, don't they? I mean, there's a lot of dots to connect there. um in fact, I hope to do a video about that at some point in the future with like the Old Testament, and how that might pertain to all this stuff about Atlantis. And there's a lot of dots to connect and a lot of threads to untangle, but we'll get there eventually, maybe. How do you grapple with knowing what you know and attempting to engage authentically and honestly in the world of the dead? I don't know what that means. Yeah, what I'm thinking about doing is piecing together because basically my tinfoil hat theory is that the bright insight guy is right about the Rashat structure, the Eye of the Sahara being the site of the city of Atlantis, and there being this kind of Atlantean civilization that spread across Africa, Central America, South America, and Egypt. And I think that the reason why none of the big monuments or pyramids or anything are mentioned in the Bible when it talks about Egypt is because the word that we're translating as Egypt actually means Atlantean. That's my thoughts on that. There's a whole lot of other dots to connect there about like the Great Lakes actually being because the rivers, quote unquote, of Eden, because the word it uses could potentially be taken to just to mean lake rather than river. And it's usually said that that's Mesopotamia, right, with the Tigris and Euphrates, and supposedly there were these two other rivers. But the thing is that the bodies of water were all supposed to stem from the same source, and that's not what we see there. There's only one place where you've got four bodies of water that all seem to stem from the same source, and that's North America. That's the Great Lakes. And then if you take the Cherokee language and compare it to Doric Greek, it's like almost the same language. It's crazy. Like there's so many parallels between Cherokee and Doric Greek. It's so weird. Like the word around WTF. I still don't know what you're talking about. The word around is poetic language. No, I didn't get my cat out, but he stopped screaming, which means he's either found peace with his lot in life or has died. Oh, and the thing with like the way that uh, people tend to call, or we used to call Native Americans red man, and then Adam in the Hebrew Bible, it literally means like man of the red earth, like man shaped from red ochre. There's all kinds of crazy little things like that. Perception navigator. If you were trying to talk to me in some sort of way, then it would be way better if you used like a complete, like solid paragraph so that I can tell like what the hell you're talking about. Because all I'm seeing is just a bunch of like disjointed half sentences. I always thought Atlantis would be in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, I mean, if it's the Eye of the Sahara and if that was surrounded by water at the time, I mean, that would be the Atlantic Ocean. Asking how all your philosophy relates to reincarnation. I don't know. Yeah, I don't really know what he's saying either. What do I think about any of those Gaia TV people? I think they're idiots who like, you know, they like making content for gullible people to make money, but they're just kind of spewing nonsense for the most part. There's a whole Phoenician monument in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with Phoenician inscriptions and Phoinos in red and Greek. I've never heard of that, but what do I think of Vervaeke? I think Vervaeke, he's like one of those guys who's like trying. You know, he's like trying to do this like Neoplatonic neuroscience thing where he's like getting as close as he can possibly get to actually being a metaphysical realist, but he's just not able to make the final leap. But I mean, his stuff is good. I sometimes listening to him is a little bit frustrating because he just gets so bogged down in technical jargon sometimes. But by and large, I mean, I think he has a lot of interesting things to say. Is there something you don't like about Deleuze's philosophy? Well, I think the critique I gave of land could also be applied to Deleuze insofar as Deleuze doesn't really see a pleroma or morphic realm as something that is existing outside of human skulls, as it were, something that is actually shaping nature and not just like a product of culture, a product of human contrivance. Now, that's questionable, though. I mean, you could ask, could you read Deleuze in a more metaphysical, realist kind of way? And I think you could. But I think by and large, Deleuze leaned more towards the anti-realist position. What do you think about organoids? I don't know what that is. Well, let's look it up. Oh, sweet. Man-made horrors beyond my comprehension. So they're growing mini organs out of human stem cells. Oh, and brains too. What could possibly go wrong? What are these used for? Are they just like studying them? Are they putting these in people? That seems risky. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really looked into this very much, but is consciousness evolution cyclical? I mean, I feel like it could be if you really zoom out. But everything that I can see is directional. It is teleological. There is a goal which is being achieved by consciousness evolution and biological evolution, which is really just another part of consciousness evolution, and the evolution of physicality, which is also just a part of consciousness evolution. Yeah, the great attractor for our solar system is what Steiner calls future Vulcan. That's the eschaton for us. And then what lies beyond that? We can speculate about what lies beyond that. But in order to talk about that, I would have to give you guys a much more thorough breakdown of like what leads up to that, and that involves looking at like the different stages of the evolution of our solar system and physicality and everything, and that's what we're getting at in the next several video essays. But I need to finish the damn things first. I definitely can't break all that down right now, but have you ever read any of Ralph Waldo Emerson? Yeah, I was really into him when I was like 14, but it's been a long time. Probably the next worst thing after the atom bomb and chemical weapons, blah, blah, blah. All right, it's been a minute. How long? Oh, damn, 3 hours. Okay, this is definitely the longest live stream I've ever done. Thank you to everyone who gave a super chat. I appreciate those. I promise to blow that money only on the finest drugs. Just kidding. I'll use it for something boring like my utility bill. What would you say on how American evangelicalism, especially Pentecostalism, is like the sort endpoint of the development of the personal experience with the divine or God? That is a very loaded question. Endpoint of the development of the personal experience with the divine. I don't think it is. But in any case, yeah. All right, guys. I'm gonna leave it at that. My voice is almost completely given out on me, and I probably need to check and see if Dimitri is or is not alive. So take it easy, comrades, and I'll see you around.